Rosh Hashanah, a vort for the Yom Tov, for the holiday. Rosh Hashanah, this is an adaptation of the Maimar found in Likutei Torah by Rabbi Shneir Zalman Liadi of blessed memory, the first Admor or the first Rebbe of Chabad. When the holiday of Rosh Hashanah occurs on Shabbos, we do not sound the shofar. Mystically, the reason for this is that the spiritual effect of the mitzvah of Shabbos is similar to the spiritual benefit of the mitzvah of shofar, so that when it is already Shabbos, it is unnecessary to sound the shofar. On the other hand, prior to the Second Temple period of Jewish history, the shofar was sounded even when the holiday occurred on Shabbos. This is because, in actuality, the spiritual benefit of shofar is somewhat more sublime than even that of Shabbos. It was therefore still desirable to obtain the spiritual effects of shofar, even though the effects of the Shabbos were present. During the Second Temple period, though, it was no longer possible to bring such a sublime spiritual level as that associated with the mitzvah of shofar into the physical world, except within the confines of the temple itself. So the practice was stopped lest the people come to inadvertently violate the Shabbos. The Mishnah tells us in Rosh Hashanah, beginning of chapter 4, on the holiday of Rosh Hashanah that occurred on Shabbos, they used to sound the shofar in the temple, but not throughout the country. This refers to the fact that even though it was permitted to sound a shofar in the holy temple itself on Shabbos, it was forbidden everywhere else. The Talmud, in its commentary on this Mishnah, explains that the reason the shofar was not sounded throughout the whole land, but only in the temple on Shabbos, is because of the possibility that someone might inadvertently violate Shabbos by carrying a shofar in a public place, which is forbidden on Shabbos. And to avoid this, the great sage, Rabbah, or Rava, either Rabbah or Rava, can't tell right now because it's in English and I'm not familiar with the Talmud, but it's either Rabbah or Rava, decreed that the holy mitzvah of shofar be performed only in the temple, thereby removing the chance for the common folk to err. Interestingly, though, there was no such decree against the people who performed mitzvahs of lulav and esrog when the first day of Sukkot occurred on Shabbos. We must understand, as the commentary of Tosfos indeed asks, why should shofar be any different from lulav? Furthermore, the mitzvah of shofar is a biblical commandment, bringing unimaginable spiritual benefit. Whatever was the justification for Rabbah or Rava's preventing the many great rabbis and holy saints who lived throughout the land of Israel in those days from performing the mitzvah on Shabbos, just because one or more too absent-minded people might err. In order to fully appreciate this matter and penetrate to its very core, we must first discuss the essential nature of the mitzvah of shofar. And since it is a concept of a lofty one, perhaps the following analogy will aid in grasping it. Human nature is such that when one individual does another a favor or some positive act, the recipient automatically feels closer, warmer toward his or her friend. Not only that, but the extent of the good vibrations, good vibes, the second person has toward the first is determined by the particular act or favor that was done to begin with. First person lent their friend a pencil. The borrower might feel warm toward him or her. If they lent the person money in time of need, certainly the borrower's natural feelings of warmth and gratitude would well up from deeper within him or her. And in both these cases, the goodwill evoked would be relatively superficial compared to the overwhelming feeling of closeness that would result if the person were to save the person's life. Our relationship with God is similar in that whenever a Jewish person performs a mitzvah, he or she brings God closer to him or her. Indeed, the very word mitzvah is etymologically related to the word tzava, connection. Tzavsa. I guess it's connection. Doing mitzvos connects the worshiper and God in a manner comparable to that discussed above. Not only does performing a mitzvah evoke a positive response from God, but the depth, allegorically speaking, of God's warm feelings, goodwill, depends on the mitzvah that was done in the manner in which it was performed. But a Jew drops a penny in the charity box. God is pleased, to be sure. But if the person actually found a poor individual and helped him or her obtain clothing, God's response is much deeper. Armed with the above insight into mitzvahs in general, we can now go on to examine the mitzvah of shofar in particular. Since the shofar is one of the key mitzvahs associated with Rosh Hashanah, we must consider it in light of its relevance to that holiday. The main theme of Rosh Hashanah is our proclaiming God's king over the universe and accepting his reign upon ourselves. The reason we pray for forgiveness is because one of the functions of the judge is to judge his subjects. Indeed, the above is the very purpose of creation. God didn't have to create the world in the first place, or he could have made it in such a way as to be obviously dependent upon him. Instead, he created the world with appearance of separateness and independence from him. So much so that a person might not even realize that God exists, heaven forbid, with the intent that we voluntarily accept God's rule upon ourselves anyway. When we do this, showing God's sovereignty extends even to areas where it is not obvious. It is one of the most beautiful manifestations of God's kingship and evokes true delight, as it were, in God. Now, saying that accepting God's kingship upon ourselves brings true delight in God is really the same thing as we discussed above. Performing mitzvahs, we bring God closer to ourselves in different ways, depending on the mitzvah, of course. God doesn't really have human emotions, saying that God is delighted, or simply anthropomorphism. What we mean that bringing about the revelation of God's kingship, where it had not been previously apparent, is considered so vitally important, so precious to God, as to evoke a godly reaction similar to the good vibrations in our example. The deepest level of human emotion, delight, is one of the deepest rooted and basic feelings. In mystical terms, we say that God delights in his kingship. By our accepting his sovereignty upon ourselves, we bring about this delight. This causes God to want to reign as our king, and he's therefore willing to overlook our shortcomings and be our king anyway. Put another way, we Jews actually have the ability to arouse and strengthen God's attribute of kingship by evoking sublime spiritual love, mystical delight, and this is our task on Rosh Hashanah. In particular, this deeper level of godliness, the spiritual level for delight, is only brought about to the midst of sounding shofars, because the shofar epitomizes our submission to God as subjects. The shofar is made of a horn of an animal, symbolizing a willingness to go, a docile animal. Okay? With that, we finally understand why the mitzvah of shofar was not performed in the realm when the Rosh Hashanah fell on Shabbos. As mentioned above, the mitzvahs all connect with God on some level or another. As explained above, elsewhere, the mitzvah of Shabbos can happen to bring us to God's response when level alone is delight. In other words, the day of Shabbos itself accomplished the same spiritual benefit as did the shofar. So that made it unnecessary to sound the shofar on Shabbos. This in itself makes a satisfying Torah insight, but in truth, we carry the matter even further. After all, it will be remembered that it was the decree of Rava that was responsible for the shofar not being sounded, Rava, not being on Shabbos. Prior to the enactment of this device, it was indeed sounded. If all the above is so, that Shabbos itself accomplishes the very same spiritual effect of shofar, why did it work out that one time the shofar was sounded even on Shabbos, with Rava's decree changing the practice only later? The answer, as before, can be appreciated by reflecting on the similarity God has made between our human selves and God, so to speak. A person can discern many different aspects to his or her capacity for delight. In fact, it is probably one of those most multifarious emotions, multifaceted emotions. Anyone may take delight in an unlimited number of things, just to the five senses, let alone five senses. He or she delights in each thing to a different degree. God made humans in his image. As is well known, that by Torah-guided contemplation of ourselves, we can better appreciate the corresponding spiritual aspects of God. In this case, just as human delight is not one indivisible level, but can actually be classified into many different degrees of delight, so too, with a spiritual level we call delight. So, some mitzvos, even those that evoke divine response from the sublime level of delight, may evoke that response on a different level of delight than our mitzvos, such as the case of Shabbos and shofar. To put in technical term, the mitzvah of shofar elicits a response from God on the mystical level known as bina de arech anpin, being a term signifying God's delight, an aspect which draws spirituality down from the level of Bina de Atzilus, whereas the mitzvah of Shabbos elicits a response from comparatively low level of delight, which Chesed of Darach Anpin, drawing its spirituality from the Chachma of Atzilus. The point is that the mitzvah of shofar elicits a response from God on a deeper level than Shabbos. It's still desirable to sound the. That's why it was still desired to sound the shofar. So even godly delight was already present because of Shabbos. Sounding the shofar brought even more heightened degree of God's delight. Despite this, though the rabbis saw it fit to enact a decree of Rabbah throughout the land, this decree was enacted in the time of the Second Temple, and the reason was that after the destruction of the First Temple, the spiritual level of Bina Datzilus could no longer be openly expressed within this world. Since, as we said above, shofar draws down good vibrations from God to that very level, since the sublime effects of the mitzvah cannot be felt throughout the realm anyway, because of the intrinsic holiness of the temple itself, though the effects of the mitzvah could still be felt there, which is why the shofar was sounded in the holy temple, even when the Rosh Hashanah occurred on Shabbos. This also explains why the mitzvahs of lulav and esrog were performed on Shabbos, even during the Second Temple period. While Shabbos and shofar evoke response from God of true delight, lulav and esrog, while still being important mitzvahs, of course, do not elicit a divine response from that particularly high spiritual level. Thus, even though Bina Datzilus was concealed in the Second Temple period, the mitzvahs of lulav and esrog were unaffected, since the godly response elicited by them did not involve that level anyway. Have a great Shabbos and blessings for a happy and healthy new year.